Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Klitzman. I am the director of the Masters of Bioethics program here at Columbia, and we're delighted to have you join us for a special session on retractions on the rise, but not enough, with Ivan Oransky. And I am delighted to have Ivan here. Ivan is the co-founder of Retraction Watch, which I think is one of the amazing websites that are out there that are seeking to enhance research integrity in the US and elsewhere. He's also a distinguished journalist in residence at NYU. He previously was a vice president of editorial at Medscape, and he was also, before that, the executive editor of Reuters Health. He's also worked at Scientific American and The Scientist. He's received many awards for his extraordinary work, and we're delighted to have him with us. We see this as an interactive session, so Ivan will be talking for a while, and then we'll be opening the floor for Q&A. So please feel free to ask questions. And without further ado, welcome to all of our attendees and to Ivan. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Bob. It's great to be with all of you virtually, and I really am looking forward to that conversation part. I like talking about these issues. I like frankly, being challenged on claims I make or assertions or even data that I may present. And so I'll hopefully you should see my remarks as an invitation to discussion rather than as sort of any big claims. But I will be making a couple claims today, and I will hopefully be as evidence-based as I can be when I make them, and you will let me know if I'm not. So again, great to be here, and without any further ado, I will pull up my slides here and get started. There we go. Okay, so there we go. Do the Zoom thing of moving everything out of the way. So I'm gonna kind of make two claims, as I mentioned, that I think are the sort of main ones here today. One is that retractions are on the rise. I don't think that's at all controversial at this point. So what I'm really going to do is provide some data that you may even be familiar with already, but just to set the stage a little bit. The second claim is that they're not on the rise enough. I'm not sure that that's all that controversial in 2024, given a lot of the coverage that we've seen, frankly, the way that a lot of these are handled. But I'm hoping that that is really a prompt for discussion about how the research community and how all of us should really be thinking about these issues. And at the with apologies for a sort of unpleasant metaphor, you could argue that all metaphors are unpleasant, but some actually work. I think that's a paraphrase of some other comment about metaphors. The sort of phase we're in now is that we've actually gotten reasonably good at building sewage plants at the mouths of rivers, right? So, where rivers meet the ocean, you need to make sure that all that pollution and sewage doesn't enter the ocean, of course. But really what you want, and the metaphor here is that, or in this metaphor, people who are finding problems in the literature and actually doing something about it I'm going to talk about those people for a bit. They're the sewage plants, right? Or the people who work in the sewage plants. But what we need to do is really move very far upstream. Like, why is sewage getting into, our pristine mountain streams, for example? Why is it getting into this, the smaller rivers, the tributaries? Why is it sort of getting all the way down to the mouth of the river? And I'm going to talk about that sort of more in the second half of my remarks today. But that's kind of my guiding claims and my sort of guiding metaphor, if you will. And so I did want to start by just dedicating this session, if you will, or at least my remarks, to someone who I believe a number of you worked with or knew of his work or knew personally, and that is Don Kornfeld, who, as again many of you may know, was a psychiatry faculty member, long-time psychiatry faculty member at Columbia. And I mention that because obviously the Columbia connection, but Don took a very active interest in all matters research integrity. I mean, he had many interests, so that's not to pigeonhole him in any way, but he found us sometime after Adam Marcus, who's my co-founder, and I launched Retraction Watch in 2010. approached us, sent us an email, I believe, and said, I'm interested in these issues. He had been thinking about them, retractions, fraud, and he had been thinking about them, I want to say since the 1980s when a lot of these things were sort of coming out. Don died in 2022. I unfortunately didn't learn that until sometime later, but I just wanted to take a moment and mark that and dedicate this to his memory. I want to say, and this was a very positive thing. Don and I did not, always agree on sort of what was happening in this space, and we came to different conclusions about various data and stories and things like that in that really positive way that you want when you are a group of people who are deeply concerned about an issue, deeply invested in an issue, in fixing an issue. Understanding it first is of course the priority. So I just wanted to note that and thank Don for everything that he contributed to this space. So let me start again by talking about the fact that retractions are on the rise. So I mentioned that, but now let me actually show you some data. This is a graphic from Nature that appeared last December. So it was the beginning of December. And in fact, that actually meant it hadn't captured everything that would happen last year, but it shows the main point here quite well, which is that last year there were a record number of retractions, more than 10,000. In fact, by the end of the year, it was closer to 11 and maybe even 12,000. They were happening so quickly. That's a lot. It is, as you can see from this, well done graphic, a trend that was not new in 2023, but quite a dramatic rise. Most of the retractions, in fact, at least it's actually more than 8,000 as in the graphic, because again, this is a little bit out of date even for the end of the year. Something like 11,000 retractions have happened just from one publisher, a publisher whose name is in fact no longer used. It's called Hindawi. It's an open access publisher. It was acquired by Wiley, which is a fairly large, scientific publisher. They publish a lot of educational books as well, business books too. More than 11,000 of them over the past year and a half, 2 years, were just because of Hindawi, and that was because Hindawi was overrun, and this is Wiley saying so, not just me. They were overrun by what are known as paper mill, which I'm going to get to, and I also want to get to, why these paper mills thrive, what they do, why they thrive, what the incentives are that are actually helping them, boosting their success. But I also want, in the spirit of, evidence-based medicine, for lack of a better term, to not just talk about the absolute numbers, because some of you, in fact, I hope many of you are sort of saying, well, and 10,000 retractions, 12,000 retractions, well, that's out of how many, right? So there are anywhere from 2 to 6 million papers published every year, peer-reviewed papers published every year, depending on, how you count them and what have you. But so again, as a percentage, still it's fairly rare. But on the right, what I hopefully have demonstrated is that there's been an increase, and that in fact, I would argue, and I will argue in a minute, that there should be more. But in 2002, so give or take 20 years ago, about 1 in 5,000 papers was being retracted from the literature. Okay, quite rare. I mean, if this were a clinical condition, we would, I don't even know what you'd call that, but it'd be considered quite rare, maybe even extremely rare. Excuse me. Last year, that number, that rate had risen to about 1 in 500 papers. Still fairly rare, right? Again, if we're thinking clinically, that's sort of not, that wouldn't be considered a common condition, but it's a heck of a lot bigger than 1 in 5,000. I'm going to argue in a moment that it should be more like 1 in 50. That's the least evidence-based claim that I think I'm going to make today, and it's a bit of speculation, but I'll explain where my thinking comes from. But clearly, retractions are on the rise, and I want to make the sort of suggestion that, because I'm often asked sort of at this point, and when I'm having conversations with people about this, and they agree that the data are concerning, they will say, well, is that because there's more fraud, right? And because retractions, about 2/3 of them are due to misconduct of some kind, misconduct, fraud. And the answer is that we're not quite sure. Certainly, there are more ways to commit fraud and misconduct now than there ever were. But what's clear is that there are a lot more people looking for these cases, a lot more people looking for these problems, and more pressure to actually do something about them. All of that means you're sort of in an uncomfortable time, right? It's like uncovering anything, again, unpleasant or even deeply problematic in the field you work in. On the other hand, that's the only way you can actually get to a better place. I don't think I have to tell people who are studying or interested in ethics that you can pretend that there are no ethical issues in the world, and I suppose maybe some of us might sleep better that way. I don't. Because I don't want to learn that something awful's been happening that I was just sort of pretending didn't exist. And so you go through this uncomfortable period, but then hopefully you get to a better place, whether it's new regulations, whether it's better practices, better guidelines, or just people behaving better, whatever it is. But that's kind of the phase we're in. So I mentioned, I'll sort of put these all up and just discuss a few of them. But I just want to give you a sense of the sorts of reasons why papers are retracted, right? So again, having given versions of this talk and talked about these issues now for about 14 years, since Adam and I launched Retraction Watch in 2010, people's understanding of what is happening has changed. Some of the terms on this slide wouldn't really have meant anything to a lot of people, even careful observers or reasonably careful observers. But a lot of these stories they're in major newspapers. They're in the New York Times, they're in the Wall Street Journal, they're in the Washington Post, and that's also international. I only mention U.S. newspapers there. I suppose that's a bit of a bias, but there's lots of interest around the world, in these issues. And so more and more people are becoming familiar with this. Jargon stops being jargon when people actually understand what it means. And so some of this is sort of now in that phase. So, what sorts of things happen? Well, plagiarism, I think you all know what plagiarism is. Hopefully you don't commit it, but you know what it is and you're aware of it. Hopefully it hasn't been committed on you. I mean, this is another thing that happens that people think about. Image manipulation, those of you who might have either at one time or still work in basic science life science labs. So where you're using Western blots, for example, to analyze proteins, to characterize proteins. This is the sort of thing that we're seeing a fair amount of. So people, maybe they forgot to run a control lane and they just sort of slap one on, or they're using an image that's actually from a different experiment that's old, and it helps them tell the story, so they include it in the paper when they really shouldn't, or they literally Photoshop something and change what it says. All these things are obviously problematic. They are what caused Mark Tessier-Levine to be investigated. He was, of course, the president of Stanford, and now has actually left Stanford altogether. But he was accused, and in fact, it's pretty clear it was someone else in his lab who sort of committed the misconduct. But he was overseeing it, of course, when he was, and this is in the early aughts, even a little bit before that. People fake data. The the sort of origin story of Retraction Watch is that someone faked data in studies of a drug called Celebrex. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Celebrex. That's celecoxib. That's one of the cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitors that was, quite obviously people were very excited about, give or take 20 years ago. There's one researcher who was faking the data. He ended up going to federal prison for charges related to faking the data. But he had made up all the data in all of his clinical trials. They were all retracted, and other things had case restitution. It's a rare case that someone actually went to prison, but the fact that he had 25 retractions actually is not even that many anymore. I'll get to that in a moment. Excuse me. People fake peer reviews. They actually come up with ways to peer review their own papers. Sometimes they do that quite directly. And so someone will submit a paper to a journal that requests, can you suggest some peer reviewers who might be good for this paper? They'll make some suggestions, but instead of, and I don't remember Bob's email address off the top of my head, but it's probably something like rklitzman@columbia.edu. And so let's say that I submit a paper and it's sort of in an area that Bob is an expert in, And I suggest him as a peer reviewer, and the editor says, "Oh, of course, I would love to have, Professor Klitzman, peer review this paper. That'd be perfect." The only problem is that I created an email address that morning, rklitzman123 at gmail.com. And guess what? I get to peer review my paper because the editor invites Bob to review the paper, but it's actually me. We have well over, actually, I think it's like 3,000 retractions in our database now that are because of this sort of behavior. And a lot of this has been mechanized, or industrialized by what at the bottom there, paper mills. So these are, companies, shady companies. You may have been reading about these as well, that they will sell you a paper if you need that to, get a job, get tenure, get promoted, whatever it is. They will sell you authorship. Someone has a paper that's submitted, it's been accepted, and it's in the final stages. Very few changes are going to happen to it. They can actually put that paper, they can put authorship of that paper, one of the spots, and it could be first author, I guess, would be the most expensive, but second, third, eighth author, whatever it is, onto a paper mill sort of auction house, a brokerage site, where you want to be author of a paper that helps your CV. You pay somebody $500, 500 euros, you get to be an author of that paper. Well, that's obviously problematic. I'm sure it's illegal in some way. I'm not a lawyer, but certainly it's deeply problematic, to put it mildly. These things are all happening, and they're happening at industrial scale for reasons that I'm going to get into. Another thing that has happened is that, of course, we see ChatGPT, other generative AI, sort of rearing its ugly head. A lot of journals have actually said, it's fine if you want to use that in some way, and you just have to disclose it. We have on retractionwatch.com, we have a list, and we need to update it because we've gotten some new submissions to our form that we have on this. We have a list of about 100 papers that have clear evidence of ChatGPT use, like, certainly exclamation point, or regenerate response, or something you wouldn't get unless you use ChatGPT, but they didn't disclose that they had used it. Again, this is something that there's always some new way to commit misconduct. There's always some new way. So it's a bit of an arms race, but this is sort of obviously one that we're looking at now. I want to give you a sense of scale on an individual level. So people who have sort of the most retractions in the world. You might know that a lot of journalists are sort of frustrated sports journalists. We wish we could be out covering, I don't know, the Yankees, the Mets, or whomever. So we kind of have to make our way and do our thing. So this is what you would get if ESPN ran Retraction Watch. It's actually a page on our site. We have a leaderboard. This is the top 10. If we go down to 30, for honestly no particular reason, that's kind of where we stopped. And the numbers change, of course, over time. I have to sort of update them. Right now, the person with the most retractions in the world has 210. He only surpassed 200 a little while ago, even though the case really happened in around 2010. So it took years, more than a decade, for some of these papers to be retracted, even though everyone agreed they needed to be. A couple interesting things about it. There are 5 people with more than 100 retractions in the world. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, well, I haven't published that many papers, well, then congratulations, you can't be in the top 10 or top 5. But obviously this isn't a list anybody wants to be on. And so I do want to note a couple things. One is that actually there are a lot of anesthesiologists on this list. I mentioned Scott Rubin. I don't know if I mentioned his name, but Scott Rubin was the celecoxib, Celebrex researcher who made up all the data. He was an anesthesiologist, right? Pain management. That's often what people are boarded in, what they specialize in when they study that. And he actually, sort of set off. We should almost thank him, not so much for the fraud, but for raising the alarm bells, because the entire anesthesiology community realized, oh, we have some problems. Let's do something about it. So that's why you see more retractions in that area. And it's because people are looking. So again, it's kind of going through that painful phase. So a lot of these are, in fact, some of them are, they publish with each other. So there's some almost like double counting, but not if you think about it from the individual level. The other thing, though, that is sort of interesting on here, and I would say that, therefore, that's a little bit of an artifact that you're seeing so much of that. It's true, but it's sort of skewed. The other thing, though, is you may notice there are actually no women on this list. You have to go all the way down to like number 27 at this point to find a woman on the list. And that's true, even if you correct for the sort of, if you will, overrepresentation of non-women, in other words, of men in positions where they're publishing papers. Someone did that, and they came out essentially the same. It was like 9-to-1 men having papers retracted for fraud. We can maybe, if anyone's a sociologist or, well, there's some psychiatrists, maybe we can all have some excuse me, speculation about why that might be, but it's an interesting thing that I'm not sure we can really explain, but it's a sort of fact. So more, on a less, if you will, I don't know if sensationalist is the right word, but it's sort of storytelling way. These are different kinds of stories, but I want to share with you the people who are actually doing the work of finding problems in the literature. You may have heard of some of these people by now because they, again, they're quoted in major news outlets. They're profiled in major news outlets. Elizabeth Bick, whose picture is there on the left, in working in the lab years ago, she has probably become the best known of the sleuths. She looks for image problems mostly. The vast majority of what she looks for are image problems, like the Martese-Levine case, for example. And these are the people doing the work. And they're, I would say without reservation, that these are, heroes and heroines of science. They are doing the necessary work of finding problems and actually trying to get people to do something about it. A lot of them, they do different things. So on the top right, you actually have Michael Dougherty. He's fascinating. He does fascinating work. He actually studies plagiarism. He's a philosophy professor, he's a philosopher, and he looks for plagiarism. And he's at a Catholic university in Ohio Dominican, and he has found a lot of plagiarism in the Catholic Church. So in other words, a lot of the academic, a lot of the bishops and what have you who have gone to certain universities that are part of the church or affiliated with the church. He's actually found, in fact, one who was like a deputy to the Vatican, deputy to the Pope, who had to retract. He was actually on our leaderboard for some time because of plagiarism. So people do, again, they look at plagiarism, they look at image problems, they look at statistical problems, all sorts of people doing this work. And the vast majority of them are doing this for nothing. Maybe it's sort of part of their job, but not really. And they're facing a lot of threats, mostly legal threats, lawsuits and things, but also sometimes personal threats. I'll actually mention that in a minute. But you can go to our site, again, retractionwatch.com. There's a page with all the sleuths on it. They're not our sleuths, excuse me, our page, but they are very much on their own. But they're really doing the work. And you just didn't see this, 20 years ago. Some journals, and again, just to try and explain why retractions are on the rise, the sleuths are doing their work, then journals are actually, some of them, and it's growing numbers, starting to do something about it. So some of and they're mostly larger journals that can actually afford to hire, additional people. They're hiring, we didn't write the headline, but, sort of research integrity managers. This is the column. Adam and I used to have a column in Stat, a weekly column actually, and this is back from 2018. So some of the journals you've probably heard of, like PLOS One. That's a sort of major basic science journal, mega journal, in fact. They hired a whole group of research integrity managers, and what's happened is they've actually ended up retracting more papers. They retracted hundreds of them over a couple of years, and people say, oh, well, that's bad, they're retracting, look at that, how many problems there are. A, it's again a really small percentage because they publish a lot, and B, it means they're doing something about it. So that's actually all good news. The rise in retractions, and maybe this is kind of a strange thing for anyone but the co-founder of Retraction Watch to say, the rise in retractions it's a good thing. It means that people are paying attention. The bad news is that this rise is actually not enough. So David Allison, who's now dean at the Indiana School of Public Health, Indiana University School of Public Health, he and his grad students and postdocs, they published this now 8 years ago in Nature, a comment piece. They found 24 papers that had clear statistical errors. And David's a master statistician and knows all this stuff. And only 8 of the journals even wrote back to them. So there are a whole bunch of problems and nobody's even, I don't know if they should be retracted or not, but nobody's even acknowledging that there's an issue or responding to it. We're saying, no, this is fine. You got it wrong. People are not even engaged with it. On a bigger scale, I mentioned already Elizabeth Bick, she's the first author here. She looked at 20,000 different papers, and she found that 1 in 50 of them, 2% of them, had features, images that had features suggestive of deliberate manipulation. Now, according to well-accepted, guidelines from the Committee on Publication Ethics, which sort of doesn't govern exactly, but sort of publishes guidelines and is well, sort of thought of as the leader in this space. It's a volunteer organization, nonprofit. That would be grounds for retraction. And yet she started alerting journals 10 years ago in 2014, and many of those, in fact, most of those papers still haven't been retracted. So there's a 2% number. There's some other lines of evidence where if you, there's a really good meta-analysis or a meta-survey almost of surveys. So a meta-analysis of surveys. It's published in 2009 by Dan Finelli in PLOS Medicine that found that 2% of researchers admitted to having committed misconduct. If you ask them, it was anonymous surveys, and that number has been sort of replicated. In other words, people have found similar figures, even sometimes higher over time. And this is, that's 15 years ago now. And so we have various lines of evidence where we would estimate that in fact 2% of papers should be retracted. That's a lot. It's a lot more certainly than there are now. There are about 50,000 retractions now. Imagine that'd be about 500,000 retractions. It would be kind of a much bigger database, which I'm going to talk about. But that's where we get all of this. And part of the reason we think so, in addition to what I was just demonstrating, is that there are a lot of papers that actually everybody agrees should be retracted, but that just never are, or that haven't been yet. And that's changing a little bit. These are all headlines from Retraction Watch that talk about years and multiple years delay. The bottom two are cases where we actually filed in public records requests for correspondence, so letters between, officials at universities that had found misconduct among one or more of their faculty, one or more of their researchers, requested on official letterhead retractions from journals, and the journals did nothing for 2 years, for 3 years. It's one thing if, someone makes an allegation. This can be very contentious. For various reasons, maybe it takes a while to investigate. These are cases where we're not starting at an allegation. We're starting at a university found misconduct. And by the way, and pretty much every university is like this. Universities don't go out of their way to find misconduct. In fact, quite the opposite. They usually find ways to not find misconduct. And so university went ahead and did that, and still the journals did nothing for years, and sometimes until we called them. So that's obviously a problem. One reason why that's happening is that people either threaten to or actually sue. They more often threaten to than actually sue. But you may have heard about the Francesca Gino case up at Harvard Business School. Very complicated case, although in some ways not complicated at all. But there's a group called Data Colada. There's 3, and they're named. They just use that as their kind of band name, if you will. They had found all these problems. They'd gone to Harvard about them, and then it got very sort of frustrated by how long everything was taking and went public with them. Harvard put Francesca Gino on administrative leave, but she turned around and sued Harvard as well as the researchers who had brought the problems to everybody's attention. Those researchers, actually, we just learned last week, had death threats, not from Gino, but from another researcher whose story we had covered, and they didn't know some of the things that we found out until we reported them. But people are facing real threats, and so publishers are facing threats. Publishers, because most of them are large, very profitable companies, lawyers have a lot of sway, and so they don't like to take risks. And so this can slow down the process. That's not good for science. I don't think that should be controversial, but it may be good for the temporary bottom lines of these companies, but it's really not good for science. And I think it's something that we, need to take into consideration. Again, just to provide some evidence, this is a group of researchers who has, again, they're sleuths. They've been doing lots of work very carefully, using their names, not anonymously. Most people actually aren't anonymous in this space. Very carefully documenting problems which turn out to be true. These are responsible for, this group of people is responsible for some of the retractions on our leaderboard. In other words, you have a very good track record. After a year, they published this paper just to talk about their experience. After a year, more than half of the journals that they approached had not told them what they were going to do, a year. So they called them slow, opaque, and inconsistent. We would agree. But it's not just, Retraction Watch or the sleuths, or even somebody's rival who says, things aren't happening fast enough. I had the privilege of testifying. I've had the privilege of testifying a couple times now in front of the House of Common Science and Innovation Technology Committee. This was a report that came out last year. I testified, so did some others who were involved in this space, and they wanted to hear from. They actually came out and said something that I thought was almost too specific, which is, the process of correcting or retracting a paper shouldn't take longer than 2 months. Now, I don't know when that starts and all that. There's some details here that are pretty important, but directionally, the idea that an external body, right, and we see this playing out in our own Congress now, where people are starting to ask questions, and a lot of this is because the scientific community, and certainly publishers, but scientists individually, really would like to pretend that these things aren't a real problem. And so but what happens when you do that, and certainly this has been happening since the 1980s in terms of scientific integrity, Congress or Parliament or whatever body will come in and do things that you may not like. But the problem is that's their role. When you capture their attention that way, for bad reason, it's not great. So in the 1980s, it was John Dingell and Al Gore, both in Congress at the time, who had hearings. Dan Koshland, the editor-in-chief of Science at the time, said, fraud really isn't a thing. It's 99.99999. Kind of went on for a while, significant digits wise with the nines. Of scientists are honest and papers are totally verifiable. It wasn't true then. It's not true now. And so what happened as a result of that is a lot of reform, some of which got pushed back, but the Office of Research Integrity, for example, which was at the time the Office of Scientific Integrity, that was founded and that was created as part of HHS, Health and Human Services, to oversee research and look into these cases, and all that. Things, however, are changing. The rate of retraction, again, is clearly rising. I hope I've demonstrated that. Other things are happening. Again, people are looking for these problems. But publishing companies are starting to feel the heat. I mentioned Hindawi already. They've actually gotten rid of that brand. They've just sort of subsumed it into the larger Wiley brand. But this is from about a year and a half ago now, where because Wiley's a publicly traded company, they had to disclose on an earnings call, a quarterly earnings call, that they had lost $9 million because they had to pause what are known as special issues. You're probably all familiar with special issues, but at a place like Hindawi, they were basically printing money. And they were not well peer-reviewed. They were not well supervised. People were sort of publishing things willy-nilly. We actually found evidence that we reported earlier this year that editors were being bribed. And a lot of this was just paper mill activity. So they actually had to tell their shareholders that they lost $9 million, which over annualized, it was something like $30 million. Their stock price went down 16% in one day. This was pretty cataclysmic for them. So again, I think that it's better if, institutions, universities, publishers sort of self-regulate and sort of, find ways. That's what a profession does. But there will be external forces, and again, they may, sort of, the pendulum may swing too much, but this is the sort of thing that is happening. So one of the other problems that has become pretty clear, and this is over decades now, is that even when papers are retracted, people keep citing them. Now, you can cite a retracted paper. There's no law against it. In fact, it may be a good idea, especially if you say, by the way, this has been retracted, so we're not pursuing this line of evidence anymore, but just so you know. That's not actually what's happening. So when you look at the biomedical literature, this is just one example. Alison Abritis, who's the last author on this, is our research director at Retraction Watch. She's been with us almost 10 years now, 9 years. She has a PhD. Her PhD thesis was actually about retraction, so it was perfect. It was wonderful. This is a study that essentially reproduced previous work by John Budd in particular. More than 90% of the time, when retracted papers are cited, they're cited as if they hadn't been retracted. I mean, think about that for a second. I imagine there are some attorneys in the audience, because tends to be some overlap of ethics and maybe even MDJDs. Think about what would happen if you showed up to a case to make an argument and you relied on a precedent that had been overturned. Like, nothing good would happen. That is actually what's happening in the scientific, particularly medical literature, every single day. And I would argue that's probably worse than any particular case of fraud. It means that, again, people are wasting effort. People are chasing down ideas that actually have been, essentially disproven, or something's wrong with them. This is really a problem. Why does that happen? And so, I actually don't think that most people do that intentionally. They don't set out to say, oh, let me find a retracted paper and then cite it in support of my idea. I don't think that's actually what's happening. What's happening is that all the systems that are supposed to help people identify retracted papers and therefore, act appropriately, are not working. So one of them is, and this is just a single example, but it's consistent with other literature and other areas. In the mental health literature, 40% of the time when people went, and actually these two researchers, librarians and library researchers, who've been focused on retractions and other important issues like this, they found that 40% of the time you wouldn't know that a paper had been retracted. Well, if you're actually doing the work of checking, and yet the publishers can't be bothered to include that information or transmit the metadata alerting, PubMed, which I'm sure all of you spent plenty of time on, like I do, Web of Science, or any of those databases. If they're not fine, if the metadata aren't there, the researchers, of course, the authors aren't going to know. So happily, thankfully, and this is the closest you'll get to an ad today. So I guess I should apologize for that. It's not really an ad, because I'm a volunteer at Retraction Watch, so I don't make a dime on any of this. B, we're a nonprofit, so is the organization that acquired our database with this news, but I will just say that it's us. Crossref, which some of you may know, they're the keepers of like DOIs and metadata and things like that. They acquired our database of retractions, which has, we have now just about 50,000. At the time it was acquired in September, we had, I think, 44,000, and PubMed, just for comparison, had only 13,000. So we have far more. For various reasons, mostly because we're actually looking for these things. They acquired it, and what that means is that you can actually, well, first of all, you can download the data, do whatever you want with it. I'm happy to talk later about that. Study it, make whatever use you want of it for free, which we think is terrific. It also provided a lot of sustainability for us, which of course is very welcome from our point of view. But what it means is that if you use any of these programs, some of you may use EndNote, Zotero, I don't know what licenses Columbia has. Any of these, Edifix is actually a Wiley product. It's a sort of manuscript, prep software, for lack of a better term. You can actually write, papers in it. These all ingest the Retraction Watch database and, they give you alerts when there's a retracted paper in your library. You don't have to do anything. So the next time you go to that paper, next time you open your library, it says, oh, by the way, that paper you've kept in your library or that you cited once has been retracted. What you do with that information is completely up to you. However, it's something that, you should think about and know about. So sorry, I just want to make sure where I was there. I'm just going to, in the last couple minutes here, I want to so hopefully I have, not necessarily convinced you, but sort of explained why retractions are demonstrated they're on the rise, explained why in a proximate way. So in other words, the proximal cause of death, if you will, is the fact that people are actually looking for these problems and publishers are trying to do something about it. And I've also explained that they should, again, giving you my explanation of why I think that there should be even more retractions. Okay, so, and tried to explain sort of some of the downstream effects of what's happening. Okay, so now in the last few minutes, what I want to show you is really sort of what happens way upstream. Right? I had this awful metaphor of sewage treatment plants, what have you. So one of the things that has happened is that people have started publishing papers and sort of really not even to be read, but to turn into metrics. And so one of the symptoms of that, or the manifestations of that, if you will, that disease, if you want to do that medically, is that there are literally hijacked journals. So there are journals, they really exist, they're real journals, And they're in indices like an index like Scopus, for example, where that's considered okay. If it makes it into Scopus, it's a legitimate journal. But then what happens is the publisher forgets to, renew the domain, right? So all of a sudden, someone else buys that domain. They sort of take they take the software, they take the machinery, and they sort of redirect it to themselves. They start publishing papers for people, accepting papers, publishing them, charging authors. That's a sort of common model now of article processing charges. It's a scam. It's literally a scam. And people don't know. This actually happened to more than 250 journals. And there are 250 journals out there that are, many of which are still indexed. We actually have, thanks to the work of Anna Abulkina, who does great work in this area, a checker where if you want to make sure that you're actually looking at the right journal, you can go, it's free, it's on our site. Again, I'll just mention that. But that's an example of what's happening here. And the reason that's happening is that everything in academia now is based on, rankings, and rankings are based on citations. So this is you all get I'm sure, because NYU, I graduated NYU from med school, they send around an email every year, many emails, please vote, for in the ranking, US News and World Report, similar kind of thing here, where you're looking at Times Higher Education rankings, which a lot of universities use, a lot of governments actually use to consider funding and what have you. If you look here, and this is pretty typical, 30% of the rankings are based on citations. And even it's actually a little bit more because research productivity is based also on citations. In order to be cited, you need to be published, obviously. And citations, though, are the easiest thing to gain. You can get other people to cite you. You can cite yourself, which ends up counting anyway, which even though it shouldn't. People come up with elaborate strategies. There are even people who come up with ways to put citations into the metadata, references into the metadata. So a peer reviewer, an editor, wouldn't even see them, but they're sort of hidden there. They count because of the way they're counted. So how does that manifest, right? So people actually charge for citations. Some of these are a little facetious, but when people actually there was a publisher who was saying, if you cite us, which would mean that their impact factor went up, which would mean, other people were benefiting from the citations and the growth and all of this, and the citation manipulation, we'll pay you $6 per citation. I mean, it was right there. It was we reported on this, they stopped doing it, but this was in their policy, right? Barabasi, he's making an argument here, not that a citation is really worth $100,000, but if you sort of extrapolate from, how many citations did it take to sort of get, higher in the rankings and get more grants for your university or something like that, which in a lot of places that's how it works. He's saying that's so lucrative, it's $100,000 of citation, more of a thought experiment than anything else. So what do people do? What do countries do? You may have seen a story in the Economist just this week saying that China has become a scientific superpower. There is certainly an argument that that's happened, but that's all based on metrics. And it's all based on the fact that China, you see this chart here, this map, is universities and countries that actually pay bonuses, cash bonuses, for publishing in certain journals, which are then, of course, cited. That's really the goal. So China happened to, and they did away with this, although no one's quite sure if it took when they did away with it. If you were you actually got a cash bonus, a multiple of the impact factor of the journal where you published. That could be quite lucrative for you. The other thing that happened was probably more pernicious, and I think will resonate with this audience, is if you wanted to be a clinical faculty member at a medical school in China, you had to publish 2 papers just to get that job, and then another 2 to get promoted. Now, remember that most clinical faculty, and this is not to disrespect them, they're good at what they do, they are not trained as researchers, is not what and they don't do research. So where did the data come from? Well, what ended up happening was, because the pressure was so high, because the universities wanted to go higher in the rankings, the government wanted to go higher than international rankings, they would turn to paper mills, which is why, getting back to Hindawi, 11,000 or whatever it is, retractions happened. This is all paper mill behavior, paper mill activity. There were universities in Saudi Arabia that was a great story from Science a bunch of years ago, where they actually hired prominent academics, particularly in math. They wanted to do better in math rankings, and they would hire them as visiting lecturers that wouldn't be their full-time job. So they would have like 3 affiliations, and the only requirement, and this is like $70,000 a year they were paying them. The only requirement was that as your third affiliation, you put the name of that university so that the metrics would count. All the publications, all the citations would count. And since there wasn't sort of a good sense of denominator, it just looked as though everybody was sort of doing more and more. And this was well documented. People create cartels. I mean, the term cartel, I mean, paper mill cartel, these are sort of organized crime kind of terms, not inconsistent with what's really happening. It's easy to tell if I'm citing someone a lot and someone else is citing me a lot. It's kind of, that's easy to pick up. You've created a cartel where it's sort of a large enough group that it's not clear, how you're all related, and yet, we're all benefiting from it because I'm citing someone who I might not even know. It's kind of like one of those old chain letters or something. Well, it's really problematic behavior, and it's all for citations. So what happens? Paper mills, right? They do very well. These are cases that we've reported on. This is a Russian site that claims that and I actually think they're right. I think they're telling the truth because they actually publish a lot of the contracts they have with the researchers. Crazy stuff. The idea that you would publish, the idea that you would have a contract when you're essentially, engaged in organized crime is kind of, to me, a little bit out there, but people have actually documented this. You can sell authorship elsewhere. IOP, a physics publisher, had to retract all these papers. So that's my story. I'm going to try and stick to it. I'll leave this up for a second because I'm always happy to hear from people afterward as well. But thank you all for, humoring me for about 45 minutes as I sort of talk about some of these issues that I've obsessed about for 14 years. And I look forward to your questions and to a discussion and conversation about these issues. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and then we can, there we go.
Great. Well, thank you, Ivan. That was fantastic and scary at the same time, and impressive what you're doing. So you're keeping tabs on this. So thank you on behalf of all of us who work in science and are concerned about science. And people who are joining us, please feel free to ask questions, to type them in the Q&A. Here's one question. Is there any mechanism to exclude retracted articles from Chat GPT queries? I think they need for, when Chat GPT kind of prints out response to something that someone asked them.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm just going to sort of duck it because I'm it's way above my pay grade technologically. I would imagine there is. Our data are open now, and so we know that they're being ingested in lots of ways, I'm sure, by generative AI. You'd actually kind of hope that. The bigger problem, though, is that I think you're all familiar with this term hallucination. Well, you're all familiar, especially the psychiatrists, with the term hallucination. I mean, metaphorically hallucinating in terms of, ChatGPT and other generative AI. They actually make up references. And so it becomes this, again, arms race of, okay, so you're excluding all the maybe retracted papers from the sort of hallucinations, but they're still hallucinating. So, I mean, the answer is, I'm sure there's a way to easily do that. They can exclude whatever they want. I would argue they should include them and sort of use that as a signal why maybe that claim isn't up to snuff.
So one question is, you're doing extraordinary work. I mean, should the government have more of a role? Should ORI, should journals have more of a role? I mean, what else needs to be done?
We're essentially, we're journalists. I mean, that's at our core. I've done some other things, but we're journalists, and so we're outside the system. We're trying to observe. We're trying to report on what we find, and hold people accountable as best we can. But there are much bigger organizations and who actually have authority and responsibility. So I'll start with the government. So I co-authored a comment, editorial in Science it's published in January, that looked at the Office of Research Integrity, right, which I'm sure many of you or all of you are familiar with. Again, I mentioned them earlier. They are, at HHS, and they essentially have, oversight of scientific integrity for NIH-funded work, right? Any PHS, to get a little technical, but that's basically NIH, CDC, some other, other agencies, some other funders. They're a tiny budget, right? And they actually had a boost in their budget the last couple of years. $15 million, I think, now is what they're proposed for the coming year. I think it's 12 million now, it'd be 15 million. Okay, that's a nice amount of money. I'd like to have that kind of money myself. However, for an agency that is essentially overseeing, even if you just count NIH, $48 billion, that's just a pittance. They don't have a lot of authority. They don't have, for example, subpoena power, which sounds a little bit in the weeds, but it's important because it means that they essentially every time they even try and investigate, and they don't do most of the investigations, the universities do them, and then they supervise them or review them. They can't, excuse me, it's a plea bargain. Like they don't have, they're not a DA, they're not a kind of, they don't have that kind of authority. So I think there are lots of opportunities for the government to take a stronger stance. Again, scientists, I think, need to watch that, because there may be players who don't have science's best interest in mind, and who might take advantage of this. And well, that's what happens. But yeah, again, NORI is just one example. Publishers, some of them actually are doing something. I don't know that this is what they want to be doing, but some of them are maybe being forced to do something. At the end of the day, though, we need to take a look at universities too and say, don't, really reconsider this whole metrics game, this whole citation and rankings game, because that's just fueling it. Because you tend to then we reported on this a couple months ago now in Science, on the journalism side. There are organizations, companies in other countries that are catering to international medical graduates who want to come and do residencies in the US. This is obviously, it's a common phenomenon, competitive, right? And you need to stand out. And one of the ways that people stand out is by doing research and publishing it. And the medical graduates know that around the world. So they sign up for these quote unquote training courses that are really just paper mills. And they guarantee you can publish a paper. And this isn't just minor journals. The American Heart Association has, had a bunch of cases where, so again, the metrics and why is that? Because residency programs want people who might publish. I don't think it's purely because they're such good researchers, or they think they are. I think it's because that's going to up their metrics and get them more competitive, applicants next time. It's all this vicious cycle that we really need to break.
Great. And again, everyone, please ask questions. We have some good questions coming in. Hello, and thank you for the information. What are the regulations in the US and Europe? Are there any at all?
Regulations in terms of publishing, or
probably research integrity, broadly speaking, the kind of issues you're looking at.
Yeah. So so in terms of publishing, essentially it's an unregulated industry. What's really interesting, for example, is that here in the States, the only agency, a federal agency, that has taken action against a publisher, a scientific publisher, academic publisher, you might think it'd be NIH, you might think it'd be FDA, sort of kind of, they're the ones who have to rely on this research. No, it was actually the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, right? So they went after a publisher called Omics, which is largely considered quite dodgy, based in India. They went after them for false advertising, and actually they won a settlement. They'll never get the money. That wasn't the point. Everybody else sort of ignores this, or just doesn't have jurisdiction, or there's no statute that supports them. So publishing itself is quite unregulated. It is interesting to watch what's happening. I mentioned ORI, of course, that's one, that's what's happening here in the States in terms of health and life sciences research. Other countries are experimenting with things, sort of sometimes using ORI as a model. Denmark, for example, has something sort of active. Australia is having a national conversation about this, or at least some people are. The UK, as I mentioned. So, there are some, it's patchwork, and not a particularly well sewn together quilt. And so I think what a lot of this is going to force is governments to maybe come up with laws, maybe, pass laws or come up with regulations. The ORI is actually the reason we published this piece in Science in January is that they're in the midst of they've proposed a new set of regulations to kind of update them for the first time in almost 20 years.
So here's a question. Have you looked at the nature of the retracted papers in terms of their importance or lack of importance? In other words, to what extent prior to retraction were retracted papers influential in altering practices in their respective scientific fields? Has this changed over time?
Great question. So, I mean, the easy answer, the simple answer is, most papers in general are not particularly influential, right? And so, it's not surprising that most retracted papers were never that influential, never cited or cited a tiny handful of times. Okay. That doesn't tell the whole story, as simple answers typically don't. And so what we see a couple things. I mean, one is that, and this is a really interesting study that came out a couple of years ago, where people actually looked at the amount of attention a paper had received was correlated with whether it was retracted. I think that's natural. And people sort of, I think, over or misinterpreted that as, it was because it was bad. Like, no, it was actually, it's like a screening test, right? If you never screened for whatever cancer or whatever you're looking for, you would see some cases, but it would be a much, much smaller number. Whereas if you start doing whatever it is, mammograms or something like that, you're going to see a lot of cases, some false positives, not to get into that. It's a whole other subject. But the point is, that's what's happening. So if you have attention on a group of research, or a group of papers or a field, you're going to see more retraction. There have clearly been cases, though, where in clinical medicine in particular, where these were influential papers. So I'll give you an example. Joachim Bolt, who's at the top, you may remember he's got 210 retractions, right? So more retractions than anyone else. He's an anesthesiologist. He was studying something called hetastarch, which some of you may be familiar with. It's basically a blood substitute, for when you're on heart-lung machine and, you kind of, those machines, the pumps sort of chew up your RBC, red blood cells and all that. This was a way to cut down the need for transfusions, for example, and keep people alive. And if it had worked, it would have been wonderful, life-saving. And it looked like it was working because he was faking data. And then when they retracted, he's had 210 retractions. When they took his papers out of the systematic reviews of the meta-analyses, it actually flipped it. So, and it wasn't just sort of, oh, well, it's not saving as many people as we thought. It's literally killing some people, right? Don't know who. These are all statistics, of course. I don't want to overstate that. But so we've clearly seen cases like this. That's kind of a high signal, case. But it's really a mix, and whether or not it reflects overall the importance of any particular paper it's a good question.
Okay, and again, everyone who's listening, please feel free to ask questions. Here's a question. Not long ago, I published an article showing that guest authorship, aka honorary or gift, is research misconduct by the definition. It is plagiarism, claiming authorship credit for something authored solely by others and not by oneself. There's also falsification. Unfortunately, the practice is rampant. To your knowledge, is anyone systematically tracking guest authorship or acting on it? A few studies have come out, but I'm wondering whether anyone has gone further.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a sort of government official. So whether or not guest authorship would necessarily qualify for what is considered research misconduct, like by federal definition, which is FFP. FFP being falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. So falsifying, it could be that you're falsifying the record, right? I'm not sure plagiarism is exactly the right term, but you could, maybe that too, but you're falsifying the record if you really didn't deserve authorship, if you don't, for example, really meet any of the criteria like ICMJE criteria, for example, for authorship. So that's at least a good theory, right? By the way, as an aside, since this is a sort of clinical milieu, I'll just say that when I first started looking at these issues and reporting on them and trying to understand what I was looking at, I kept hearing FFP from people. I read FFP, and I didn't know what it stood for until a little while later. And I kept going, wait, oh, this must be a big story here. If you're telling me that, fresh frozen plasma, which is what I thought of when I thought of FFP, because I was the med student who ran down to, a long time ago now, but ran down to, get the type done in the lab and everything. Wow, if there's fraud in blood transfusions, I want to write about that, and I'm sure Bobby would be interested in hearing. I mean, is an ethical conundrum anyway. Turns out to be much more boring than that: falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. Anyhow, to get back to this question, so no one, as far as I know, no one is tracking guest authorship. I think it'd be very difficult to do that. There was a good survey though. There's been a couple good surveys, and where people demonstrate, in different parts of the world, they do surveys of researchers anonymous and ask them, how often has it happened to you? Or maybe even how often have you contributed a guest authorship, an honorary authorship? There's some good data on it, but I wouldn't say that anyone has, tracked it systematically.
So I wonder about training students about the ethical issues, about spotting this problem, the consequences, et cetera. Have you noticed an uptake in this being incorporated into academic programs, or any suggestions about doing this?
Yeah, again, I don't have a baseline, so I don't know if it's growing or what have you. I will say that Adam and I are frequently asked to take part in or give guest lectures or something like that in responsible conduct of research training. I'm sure you've all been, anyone who's doing research, federally funded or otherwise at this point does that. I'm sure Columbia has, a rigorous program, NYU does, which is obviously where I'm sort of based as an academic. So, we're definitely asked to do a lot of that. Formal, I see some really interesting courses that people either let us know about or ask us to get involved in, again, speak to their students. It's hard to say. I think that what is happening is that and maybe this is a slightly different way of thinking about it, there's a sort of professionalization of the whole field. So there's a World Conference on Research Integrity now. It actually just happened 2 weeks ago in Athens. And that, it's one of these meetings that moves around the world. Every 2 years it happens. And there's a whole industry now. And a lot of that's good. Some of it is probably too much professionalization, because you don't want that field to fall victim to the same problems other fields have. So there's that. And I think that has sort of turned into certainly training for editors and for publishers and for, PIs. I don't know that it's necessarily filtering down yet, but I don't know. It probably is. I can't, point to data on that.
How do we stop people from harming others? Is this just the same issue we see worldwide in so many different ways?
Ooh, that's a great question. I wish I knew, and I wish I had a magic wand. I think I really think it gets back to incentives. I end up sounding like a broken record on that, but I don't think that I don't think that's just some small percentage of people they wake up every morning wanting to harm people. I know there are, right? Let's not sort of talk about sociopaths and psychopaths. There are those people, and there are probably some in science. I mean, let's be honest about that. That being said, I think most of us, have within us, sort of the capacity, and maybe you might even say willingness to do things that aren't exactly right. And sometimes, I'll tell you, famous, what I think of as an infamous sort of case, which gave rise to a lot of thinking in terms of this field and awareness. And that was someone named, still is named, Diederik Stapel, social psychologist in the Netherlands, quite prominent, but was found out to have been faking data, and actually wrote a memoir, which, got to put a caveat in front of anything I say now, because the very person who was found to have faked data and admitted it is now writing a memoir. So, okay, truth, narration being what it is. But what he wrote in it, I think actually resonates and sort of makes sense. And that is, at the beginning, he didn't start by making up data. He started by like, oh, I need to publish some stuff. When I look at this data set, it's messy. And yeah, it still tells the story, but in a kind of muted way that isn't going to get me into a top journal, maybe not even into the journal I really want, et cetera. So what does he do? Oh, he looks at the data and he says, well, those over there, those are outliers. I think that they're a mistake. I don't know. Whatever the experiment was that he was doing, he made a mistake. Let me exclude those. and then you sort of exclude more and more. And what you noticed was nobody caught him. Nobody was paying any attention. And then you start making it up. I liken it to, and of course, this is just, just a hypothetical story. I would never would have occurred to me to do this, but let's say you're in high school and you and your friends decide you want to taste alcohol. You want to see what that's like. And your parents, or wherever situation you're in, they've got a bottle of some clear liquid, clear alcohol. There's plenty of clear alcohol out there, right? And you pour some into a glass. Your friends all have some. You put water back in the bottle, right? And then nobody can tell. By the end of high school, you've got a very nice looking bottle of water that says Smirnoff on the outside of it. And that's kind of what he did. And I don't know, I think we all have that within us. And so I think we need to create better incentives. We need to do away with the bad incentives and really, think about our humanity rather than sort of punishing people or just thinking about you're the one harming. Because honestly, when I would argue, and maybe this will be controversial, but I would argue that those of us who don't do anything, when we see clear, harm, misconduct, whatever it is, unethical behavior, and just sort of let it go, which we all do. I'm not excluding myself from that. That is much more pernicious. And so, yeah, punishing the people who are doing it, but we got to look inward and think of why didn't we say anything? I mean, it's a great book. I don't know, maybe he's even done one of these talks or something, or if he hasn't, he'd be great. But Bob, you must know, you must know Carl. I can't believe Carl Elliott.
Yes.
That's right. So just
Carl's speaking next month, by the way.
Okay. So there you go, introduction. But he's, a whole book on whistleblowers and, again, courageous people. We actually read an excerpt that was related to some of the stuff we do, and and that, how do we think about that?
So, question: the origins of many studies are driven by political agenda, climate change, Sierra Club versus Exxon, etc. I'm sure you recall the COVID studies retracted by the Lancet and New England Journal about hydroxychloroquine. Do you track retractions within political context by issue? If not, can you please recommend a reliable source? I guess how much of this is, or what percent of retractions are sort of, people fudging stuff for political agenda is one question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's a complicated answer that I'll try to do justice briefly. It certainly happens. I think we've just seen, and there's actually a story in the Wall Street Journal today about some retractions. And remember, what we're looking at is retractions. Like that's our lens, that's our frame. And so we're looking at, should this paper have been retracted? Or should this paper not have been retracted? I mean, vice, et cetera, all sorts of variations. And one sort of interesting example of that, and again, Wall Street Journal did a story about this today. A lot of the studies of mifepristone and other sort of, again, colloquially abortion pills and what have you, that, and this, of course, kind of was anticlimactic when the Supreme Court basically said, well, no jurisdiction, you don't have standing, which is it's a technicality legally, right? They didn't get into the actual science, but these were studies that were actually being used by parties to litigation that were saying, there's a lot of risk to these pills and things, but there were problems with the studies. I think it's true that retractions can be weaponized. We've seen this from day one with what we do, but I would argue that the big problem is not the politicization of particular findings or particular sort of, I mean, certainly people do, maybe tend towards certain, philosophies, to politics. That happens, but it happens because people, again, maybe they want funding or what have you. And I think it's actually a vanishing minority. Yes, the papers about hydroxychloroquine were, and only one of them was actually about hydroxychloroquine of the two that were mentioned. One that was the Lancet paper. The paper in New England Journal of Medicine was actually about a whole bunch of other drugs. Those were, the data are almost clearly faked and nobody knows where they're from. And certainly they got into those journals because they were sort of provocative and had big findings. On the other hand, there have been, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going to maybe get the number wrong, but we have more than 400 retractions of COVID-19 papers that we've cataloged since obviously the beginning of the pandemic. And most of them, you could argue exactly the opposite. We're actually sort of political or sort of agenda driven in ways that, for example, that said hydroxychloroquine worked, right? We'll have a story up tomorrow morning about some more questions about a particular paper that was claiming hydroxychloroquine worked. So I don't want to say it's sort of both sidesism, but if anything, the evidence is more on a different side of things. So I would be more concerned about profiling. I would be more concerned about sort of only looking skeptically at work that you disagree with than I would be sort of concerned, because then, you're profiling. And so you're only going to find now, there's a role for it. If something's wrong with the paper, let's do something about it. So I don't care if I agree with it or not. I agree with the sort of finding or not, or it doesn't make me comfortable. But that's actually not, it's a problem, but it's not sort of, we really run the risk. And I think, Congress is doing this right now. We really run the risk of, focusing on the wrong problem when we don't, again, move further upstream.
All right, we just have a few minutes left. I'll ask you this one last, this one might be quick. So I quote, I can show someone's quoting a bioethicist who said, quote, I can show you more scientists and physicians that are unethical, equal to or more than unethical lawyers. So just, I mean, what do you think of the overall rate? Is it compared to misconduct in other professions? And are there any predictors of who's, you mentioned women are less likely to be in the big list. Maybe you don't have enough data, but any other predictors of who tends to be the ones who get retracted, young, old, where they train, what they trained in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always cautious here because retractions are a mark of attention. They're a mark of who's actually getting looked at. Doesn't mean that that group has more or fewer, I'm sorry. So, people have done some studies like that. I don't think they're very compelling yet. Right now it's just sort of a mix. I mean, again, the women thing, that's interesting. I would push back on this notion that somehow there are more, I'd love to see the data. Let me start there rather than saying I'd necessarily push back. Because we were at a fascinating, years ago, Adam and I were part of a fascinating, it was kind of a roundtable. It was actually part of an RCR course at Cornell, at Weill, on the east side. And what the person who got us together, she was the research integrity officer at Cornell at the time, and a great thinker on these issues. She got together a bunch of people who in different ways were doing accountability work, right? So, and then she considered us doing accountability work in science and scientific publishing. She had someone else who was looking at holding drug companies accountable, right? In different ways, litigation and things like that. And there was someone else and they've just won like yet another Pulitzer Prize, and they're amazing. It's called the Invisible Institute, and the person who was representing them, who founded it, was called Jamie Calvin. Now they're in Chicago, and they do all sort of justice issues, but one of them in particular, Jamie has always been very focused on, is police misconduct. And as we went around the table, we all realized in different ways, we just sort of, what do you call it? Coincidentally or just sort of spontaneously had these 2% numbers in mind. And Jamie actually said, yeah, when you look at records, because he's gone to battle, public records requests, all sorts of things, suing police departments and et cetera, to get misconduct reports. There's this 2% thing that happens. So I guess I'd love to see the data on why that ethicist said that. I don't doubt that they said it. I would just like to see the data. But I happen to think that maybe 2%, there's something happening there, and we're all kind of, 2% likely maybe to do something that would be considered misconduct.
I have 20.
I think it's probably, kind of even, but I think we all need data on that.
Great. Well, unfortunately, out of time, but this is fascinating and so important. So thank you, Ivan, so much for all your amazing insights. Thank you to all of you who asked questions. I want to invite you all to our next session, which is with Carl Elliott. And that will be on July 11th, 4:30 to 5:45, about why they blow the whistle, exposing abuses to human research subjects. And also, FYI, it's on your calendars, I'll be talking on October 17th about a book I have coming out this fall, Doctor, Will You Pray For Me? Medicine, Chaplains, and Healing the Whole Person. So please also check our website out for some of our past talks. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ivan, again. And we look forward to being in touch. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much. Be well.
Stay cool. Bye-bye.